Okay, good afternoon and welcome everyone. Today is the first in the new term's Sussex Development Lectures, and we're very lucky to have with us here today Hamza Hamouchene, who's going to be talking about dismantling green colonialism, energy and climate justice in the Arab region. And for those of you that don't know about the Sussex Development Lectures, this is a series of lectures showcasing key thinkers in global development. It's jointly run by the Institute of Development Studies, where we are here today, the School of Global Studies, the Science Policy Research Unit, SPRU, and the Centre for International Education. The format is that we'll have a talk now by Hamza for about 40 minutes or so. And then there'll be time for audience questions and answers. And we have many people joining online, about 190, I believe. So it's a very popular talk today. And we'll hear those questions from the audience too. There's a recording of the lecture will be available afterwards and emailed to all attendees. So please do share with colleagues that weren't able to be here today. And please do sign up also for other Sussex Development Lectures this term. The next one, I believe, is next week Wednesday, by Dr. Catherine Mola, talking about hurling money at EdTech, understanding public funding and private profit during COVID-19. And you can register for your place at that event on the IDS website. So let me just briefly introduce our speaker today, Dr. Hamza Hamouchene, who's a London-based Algerian research activist, commentator and founding member of Algeria Solidarity Campaign, the Environmental Justice North Africa Group, and the North Africa Food Sovereignty Network. He's currently the Arab Region Programme Coordinator at the Transnational Institute, and his work has focused on issues of extractivism, resources, land and food sovereignty, as well as climate, environmental and energy justice in the Arab region. He's author and editor of 4 books, Dismantling Green Colonialism. We have some copies here, which apparently some are available if you're willing to make a donation afterwards. A book on the Arab uprisings, A Decade of Struggles, a book called The Struggle for Energy and Democracy in the Maghreb, and The Coming Revolution to North Africa, The Struggle for Climate Justice. But he also writes in The Guardian, Middle Eastern Eye, Counterpunch, New Internationalist, and many other media outlets. So we're very, very lucky to have him speak to us today. So Hamza, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Peter. Perfect. Thanks, Peter, for the kind introductions. Thanks for Will for the invitation. Thanks for all the people who helped organize this lecture. I'm really glad to be here with you. Hi to the people online. So I prepared a few slides to tell you a story about the main ideas and arguments of this book, Dismantling Green Colonialism, Energy and Climate Justice in the Arab Region. But before I get into the details and the main ideas, telling you about the main ideas of the book, since the 7th of October, I always start my talks and presentations by saying that we cannot talk about colonialism, green or otherwise, about dismantling it, about decolonization. We cannot also talk about climate justice in the Arab region and beyond, and turn a blind eye to the genocide taking place in Gaza, to the ethnic cleansing and displacement of ongoing ethnic cleansing and displacement of Palestinians committed by deeply racist apartheid and settler colonial state of Israel with the active support of imperialist powers, from the United States to the European Union, to the UK, to France, Germany, and so forth. Obviously, we need to continue for the end of genocide and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, but in the long term, we need to continue our active solidarity with Palestinians in their struggle for emancipation, liberation, and the right for self-determination. Because nowadays, there is a lot of talk about decolonization, especially in mainstream academic circles, where we hear decolonize this, decolonize that, but nothing rooted in the material reality of struggle of people fighting for justice, fighting for liberation and emancipation. So I think it's really important to start by saying this. So why do we talk about the energy transition? We hear a lot of talk in mainstream media by the global ruling classes, in academia about the needed transition towards renewable energy. Obviously, it is because of the intensifying ecological crisis and the worsening climate impacts that we are seeing everywhere in the global north and in the global south, maybe with much worse impacts in the global south. That ecological and climate crisis has its manifestations clearly in the Arab region. We are seeing the destruction of environment, the pollution, the exhaustion of natural resources, as well as water poverty, and add to this the intensifying climate impacts that we have been seeing in the last decade or so. That goes from floodings. I don't know if you heard of the floodings that took place in Libya last September. Just 24 hours of downpours caused the partial destruction of a whole town and the killing of around 10,000 people. And we have wildfires, we have the desertification, the sea level rises that threaten the existence of whole islands like Jerba and Qarna in Tunisia, and so forth. But this climate and ecological crisis does not happen in a vacuum. It intersects with other forms of crisis. The food crisis, the energy crisis, and the socio-economic crisis in those countries in the Arab region. For me, I don't think we can appropriately understand or grapple with this climate and ecological crisis without looking into the capitalist extractivist model of development that has been imposed in the regions and other parts of the global south by imperialism since colonial time. So what do I mean by extractivism? Extractivism is a mode of appropriation and accumulation that has been unleashed all over the planet since the 15th century with the European invasion of the Americas. And as you can imagine, that process has been shaped by exploitation, by plunder, by slavery, and by blood. And a similar process has taken place in the Arab region in the 19th century during the colonial period. Extractivism, strictly speaking, refers to those activities which remove large quantities of natural resources that are not processed or processed to a limited degree, especially for export. And this relation of dependency on the global market, it's what determines extractivism. And when we talk about extractivism, it's not just limited to minerals or oil. It is also present in farming, industrial farming, what we call agrobusiness, forestry, industrial fishing, and even tourism with its intensive water use. Throughout my field visits to various sites of extractivism, either fossil fuels or minerals like phosphates in Morocco and Tunisia, or even agrobusiness, I saw alongside the destructions of the environment, the pollution, the prevalence of diseases, what the dependency school calls the development of underdevelopment, and what David Harvey calls the accumulation through dispossession. Because on one hand, you see the richness and the wealth of those regions in natural resources, and in the other hand, you see the environmental destruction, you see the poverty, you see the unemployment, and you see the underdevelopment. And this is the paradox of extractivism, as it creates sacrifice zones with sacrificial people in order to maintain the accumulation of capital and profits. And when we say sacrifice zones, we see the bodies of people, their air, their environments, their water are being sacrificed in order to maintain those the accumulation of capital. And the examples are numerous in the region. Ain Saleh, one of the richest gas towns on the continent in Algeria, I visited it back in 2016, is is, as I say, is very rich in terms of gas resources. But when you look at its infrastructure, it's very poor. The only hospital that they've got, they call the hospital of death. And the examples abound in the region, from Tunisia to Morocco to Egypt and so forth. And of course, we cannot disentangle the extractivist dynamics from the global war machinations and the militarist governance of the world. And in this respect, Iraq and Libya warrant more attention, as they are the victims of the violence caused by fossil fuels and the Western fighter jets and bombs that go searching for their abundance. And I'm putting this slide here just to share with you other theoretical frameworks, because my analysis on extractivism is placed within this ecological unequal exchange and ecological imperialism. And I really encourage you to look more into that literature. But briefly speaking, unequal ecological exchange is the asymmetrical transfer of ecosystem goods and services from one region of the world, what is called the peripheries, or generally the global south, to another region of the world, which is the cores or the centers of empire, mainly in the global north. So therefore, ecological imperialism is the subjugation of the economic, political, and all social institutions of a generally peripheral country for the biophysical, metabolic needs of the generally core country. And this is inextricable from the purpose of making such resources accessible and amenable to the needs of capital accumulation. And I want you to remember this analysis on extractivism and ecological imperialism, because when I move towards the analysis of the energy transition or the transition towards renewable energy in the Arab region, we see those dynamics of extractivism, neocolonialism, and ecological imperialism being reproduced and even entrenched in the name of sustainability. So in that context, a transition to a more sustainable system has become inevitable, but justice is not guaranteed. And a lot of us who have been studying those dynamics called the entrenchment of those extractivist and neo-colonial practices, call them in the name of sustainability as green colonialism or green neo-colonialism or green grabbing. And I'm gonna give you concrete examples from various countries why we are calling them exactly this. But before I get into that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the neoliberal global governance and the ecological climate crisis in the region and globally. So every year, global leaders with their advisors, with the mainstream media, and the corporate lobbyists, including the lobbyists from the fossil fuel industry, meet in what is called the Conference of the Parties, the climate summits, the climate talks that happen every year. And I think it's much more appropriate, given their failure and bankruptcy, to call them the Conference of Polluters, because that's how they have become, unfortunately. 3 decades of talks since the 90s, talking about addressing the climate crisis, and the CO2 emissions kept increasing. The only year that they decreased was the year of the pandemic, before going up again. And the climate crisis kept escalating with huge impacts that we are seeing all over the world, including in the global north. The Arab region has hosted 5 of those talks, 5 of those summits. The most 2 recent ones were COP27, in Sharm el-Sheikh, in the beautiful democracy of Sisi in Egypt, and COP28 in another authoritarian fossil fuel-rich regime. And I think it's really worth saying that the COP28 president was the head of the Abu Dhabi Petroleum Company. It's like giving the responsibility of putting off the fire to the arsonists. And COP29 was the same story, another oil-rich or fossil fuel-rich dictatorship where those talks have happened. And I think I've attended actually just 4 days of those talks to do some Palestinian activism at the time. And from what I heard, it's one of the worst climate talks that have happened. So, as I said, these talks have become bankrupt and they are clearly failing. But it's not just because they are taking place in authoritarian regimes or fossil fuel-rich countries, but because the corporate sector has hijacked them by pushing forward for profit-making false solutions. I'm sure all of you have heard about net zero, about carbon trading, about nature-based solutions. All this sounds wonderful, but in reality, they are just the same paradigms of dispossession, the same paradigms of making more profits, profiting from the climate crisis, while maintaining the status quo. It's basically capitalism greening itself. The main actors shaping the response to the climate, ecological, and energy crisis in the Arab region and in the world are these you see in the slide. The EU agencies, international financial institutions like the World Bank, and international development agencies from the GIZ to USA to the French Corporation and so forth. These actors are really active in the region, producing reports and studies in various languages, including in Arabic, but also organizing workshops and conferences, training the next generations of activists and climate guarders. Despite their activism, these institutions and these actors are aligned with the interests of the rich and powerful, because their analysis of the climate predicament does not take into account questions of class, questions of race, questions of gender, questions of power, and questions of colonial legacy. The solutions that they promote, first of all, they come from the top to the bottom, from the so-called experts, excluding local communities and workers from any decision around their resources and around their land, and they further promote privatization. Privatization, when I say privatization of everything. Privatization of land, privatization of food, of water, of energy, and even privatization of the atmosphere through the mechanisms of carbon trading. So briefly, or in a nutshell, these institutions and these actors are the enemies of climate justice. And these institutions, with the ruling classes in the region, the governments in the region, are promoting a kind of an orientalist colonial environmental narratives that has been developed in the 19th century by French and British colonialism in the region. One iteration of that environmental orientalism in the Arab region right now is that the desert, the Sahara, is an empty, vast land, sparsely populated, representing an El Dorado of renewable energy. So Europe can get its cheap electricity while it continues its energy-intensive consumption and production pattern. This narrative is deceptive. First of all, because it does not take into account questions of property and sovereignty, basically who owns those lands and resources and who gets to decide how they are used and how they are redistributed. And also it obfuscates ongoing global relations of imperialism and neocolonialism, ending up excluding local communities and workers in shaping that just transition that they would like to see in their own countries. So what is green colonialism? Green colonialism, just briefly, it is the extension of the colonial relation of exploitation, plunder, and dehumanization of the other to the so-called green era, the period of renewable energies. And this happens, as in colonial times, by the externalization of health, environmental, and social costs from one region of the world, which is the cores and the centers of empire, the global north, to the peripheries of the system, the global south. So basically, we have the energy and environmental priorities of the global north coming first and at the expense of those priorities in the peripheries of the world. That energy transition that we are talking about, and I think it's much more appropriate to call it an energy expansion, and I'll say that later on, is predicated on the ongoing and the continuation extraction of basic and rare minerals that are needed to manufacture wind turbines, solar panels, electrical batteries, and so forth. Those resources like lithium, copper, cobalt, nickel, graphite, and rare earth minerals are needed for that transition. But if we're going to continue the same patterns of capitalist intensive production, it means that we need to extract more of those resources. And where would these resources come from? They would come from countries like the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where another genocide is taking place. They would come from countries like Indonesia, Myanmar, where there is another civil war taking place. They would come from the lithium triangle in Latin America, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, where extractivism is going to intensify and the exploitation of workers is going to get worse. Green grabbing is just briefly refers to those dynamics of grabbing land, appropriating land and resources for supposedly environmental ends. And that can range from the confiscation of indigenous communities' land in the name of conservation, or the appropriation of land from agro-pastoralist communities to build big solar plants and wind farms without their approval and consent. Let's go into concrete examples now. Carbon offsets. I think carbon offsets are a form of green grabbing and green neo-colonialism in certain parts of the world. This Emirati company called Blue Carbon has been acquiring hundreds of thousands of hectares in 5 African countries: Tanzania, Liberia, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Kenya. Carbon offsets, they are being promoted as a climate solution where a company like BP and Shell or fossil fuel producing country can continue their operations without any change while paying such companies to conserve forests in other countries or plant trees or do some renewable projects and saying we're going to reach net zero at some point in the future. Those carbon offset mechanisms have been shown by many academic studies, by many investigations and journalists to be fraudulent, first of all. And second, to be inefficient, because if they were working, we would have seen CO2 emissions going down. But on top of that, they are producing more negative impacts and more injustices in terms of displacing indigenous communities and local communities from those environments. And of course, those companies are going to use the orientalist and colonial environmental narrative that those forests are empty, they are not being used, and so forth. But the main argument, the main point from these slides that I want you to take away is that what we are seeing through these mechanisms is a shifting of responsibility. A shifting of the responsibility of tackling the climate crisis, of mitigating the CO2 emissions from the biggest polluters, which happen to be countries in the global north, but not just countries in the global north. The Gulf countries as well are responsible for that. And corporations and fossil fuel corporations, to the least responsible in causing the climate crisis, in here, the African countries, the more vulnerable and the least equipped to tackle the impacts of climate crisis in terms of finance and technology. This is what we call green colonialism. I studied the Ouarzazate solar plant since 2016. It's one of the biggest solar plants in the world. At the time, in 2016, just before the climate talks that were held in Marrakesh that year, it was portrayed as the biggest solar plant in the world, and the Moroccan monarchy was praised for its role in doing its bit for the environment. But a little scratch under the surface would reveal a bleak picture. First of all, this is a green grab. The 3,000 hectares where this solar plant has been built have been taken away from the pastoralist communities that were using that land for centuries to graze their animals without a proper consultation process. Basically, what happened is that the authorities, they took 2 or 3 representatives of the community, took them to a 5-star hotel, and they presented the study to them. They said, this is the king's project, and everything was done. So a green grab. Second, this is not a project owned and by the communities or by the Moroccans. It is owned by private hands. What is called the public-private partnership. The public-private partnership is just a euphemism for the privatization of profits. So the companies, the private companies running this project, which is a Saudi company called Aqua Power, with an alliance of Spanish companies, have their profits guaranteed whatever happens with this project. So it is in private hands. And then it ended up contracting huge amounts of debt, $9 billion from the World Bank, from the African Development Banks, from other European banks, with Moroccan guarantees, which means if the project fails or goes into debt, who pays for the project? It's the Moroccan citizens. And this is exactly what is happening. Since 2016, this project, because it has been using an expensive technology called CSP, concentrated solar power, has been losing 80 million euros a year. And of course, it is pocketed by the Moroccans. But even looking at its green credentials, we see that the solar plant needs an extensive use of water to cool down the system and clean the solar panels. And that water was coming from a nearby dam. Actually, I visited that dam 3 times, and that dam has dried. Not just because of the water going to the solar plants, but because of the semi-dry and the droughts that has been impacting the region. So even the green credentials, it does not stand. And promoting a project like this as green while creating other issues, especially in water poor regions, I think it's deeply problematic. Same story about another solar plant to the northeast of the Ouarzazate solar plant in Morocco, called the Middle solar plant. It's gonna be the biggest hybrid solar plant in the world, combining 2 technologies, the concentrated solar power and the photovoltaic. It has been delayed for a few years. It was supposed to be online in 2020, but there were delays. The local pastoralist communities have been protesting against it. Some of them have been jailed. And as you can see from this quote from this pastoralist, he's saying basically it's an occupation. We're not benefiting from that project. So this is just another example of decarbonization by dispossession in reference to the concept I described earlier by David Harvey, accumulation of dispossession. So we decarbonize the economy by dispossessing people and further excluding them. Another dynamic, an important dynamic in the book, described and analyzed in 5 to 6 chapters around Egypt, Sudan, Tunisia, Morocco, and Jordan, is the dynamic of the liberalization of the energy sector and the privatization of renewable energy with an export orientation, especially from the North African region. And the many chapters go into those dynamics and show how international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF have been really active in liberalizing the sectors and pushing for the privatization of energy, including green energy. Let me tell you a little bit about Tunisia so we can go in concrete details why those dynamics are really neo-colonial and unjust. So Tunisia's share in terms of emitting CO2 is around 0.07%. Tunisia is a small country. But its strategy in tackling the climate crisis focuses a lot on reducing CO2 emissions. So there are two strategies to tackle the climate crisis: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is you reduce the CO2 emissions. Adaptation, you adapt to the climate impacts. Mitigation should be for industrialized countries or the historically responsible in causing the climate crisis, which happened in the global north. And adaptations is mostly the global south that are having the impacts of the climate crisis. But as I said, Tunisia's strategy in terms of tackling the climate crisis is lopsided. So it's putting much more of its resources towards mitigating the climate crisis, while its share is very, very low. I'm not saying that nobody is responsible. Every country has its own responsibilities, but those responsibilities are differentiated. So why is it lopsided? The easy liberal explanation is, those countries or those governments are corrupt, they mismanage their affairs, and so forth. There is some truth in that, but I don't think it's the explanation. The explanation is that Tunisia has been influenced by international actors that are pushing it towards building more renewable energy projects and mitigating CO2 emissions. And one of them is the GIZ, the German Development Corporation. The German Development Corporation, GIZ, has an office in the energy minister. And it's not just a small office, it's a big office where they dictate all various strategies and documents, green hydrogen, climate crisis, renewable energy, and they push the governments toward a certain area. And we've seen in 2019 a change of a law that allow the use of agricultural land in Tunisia to build or to use them for renewable energy projects. For a country that has been suffering from food crisis, and we've seen that during the pandemic and after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because Tunisia depends on wheat that comes from Ukraine, we start wondering, energy transition for whom? And I think this is an important question that we need to ask. Energy for what and energy for whom? That export orientation that I mentioned, I'm going to show you two projects, one in Tunisia and one in Morocco. The Tunisian project, Tunur. Tunur, I've been looking into this project in 2017. At the time, in their website, they were saying we're going to build a bigger solar plant than the Warzat solar plant in Morocco, in southern Tunisia, in a region called Gbelli. And all the electricity generated will be exported, all of it, to Italy, to the European Union, and even to the UK. And Tunur is a company which is headquartered in London. It's formed by British capitalists, Italian capitalists, Maltese and Tunisian capitalists. So they changed the narrative because they received a lot of criticism and they didn't mobilize the money. Now they are saying we're going to produce a little bit for Tunisia, but we can export, and they are jumping on another thing, which is green hydrogen. If I have time, I'll tell you a little bit. So you may say, what is wrong in exporting green electricity and getting, foreign currency? First of all, 60% of Tunisian electricity is generated from imported Algerian gas, right? And an additional 11% of electricity comes from Algeria. So Tunisia is not self-sufficient in producing its own electricity. So why do we go into, promoting such projects for export? Isn't the priority to produce green, cheap electricity for local usages first before even thinking about export? But capital does not think like this. This is another project, X-Links. I don't know if you heard of it. X-Links, I came through that project actually during the pandemic in 2021. And I read it, it was in Bloomberg. At first, I didn't believe it. Like the ex-Tesco CEO wanted to build big solar plants and wind farms in southern Morocco, constructs a new 3,800 kilometers electrical cable undersea. That takes the electricity to Devon. At first, I thought it was just hype because it's expensive and technologically and logistically is very complicated. But then 1 year later, in end of 2022, I saw it in the UK energy strategy. It was just one line saying there is this project that may provide green electricity for 8 million people in the UK. But then there was another article in 2023 in the Financial Times by the energy minister then, I forgot her name, saying, yeah, we're definitely considering that project. So that project now, many companies have jumped on the bandwagon, including the Saudi Aqua Power, but there are other fossil fuel companies also interested. And what we are seeing here is basically the same patterns of extractivism and grabbing and the usual colonial schemes by creating, the new green sacrifice zones. Again, why we are being critical to such projects. Morocco, even if it is relatively advanced in terms of producing renewable energy compared to Algeria, Tunisia, and Egypt, still 80% of its electricity comes from imported fossil fuels, gas and coal. So the priority for such projects should be to produce green electricity and achieve energy self-sufficiency first inside Morocco before even thinking of exporting it to the UK. And green hydrogen is the same story. Green hydrogen is that miraculous solutions that is being put forward to replace gas. So the protagonists of that say green hydrogen is going to be used in cars, in ships, in planes. We're going to use it for heating. So we're just going to replace, gas with green hydrogen. But green hydrogen, first of all, it comes from the electrolysis of water. So you have the molecule of water, you break it with green electricity, and you generate hydrogen and oxygen. That hydrogen is the cleanest form. So you need water, right? You need desalinated water, more specifically. And in water-poor countries like Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and Egypt, rather than using that desalinated water for your own usages in terms of agriculture and drinking, we're gonna push it towards the production of green hydrogen for export. Because most of those green hydrogen projects being promoted in North Africa right now are for exports, and they are pushed by Germany, specifically Germany. Look at this project by Total Eren in southern of Morocco. It's gonna need 180,000 hectares of land, larger than the surface of the greater London area. And it needs a lot of water and a lot of investments, but is it really to the benefits of Moroccan citizens? I mentioned that I think it's much more appropriate to talk about energy expansion rather than energy transition. And I read a book in December over Christmas around the transition. It was in French. I think it has been translated into English. The title is More and More and More, I think. And the author has a line there saying transition has become the language of capital because it's always been delayed. We're gonna, transition in the future. We're gonna have the technology. We're gonna resolve it. And exactly that's what we are seeing. We're not seeing a real move towards renewable energy. More subsidies, like if you look at the global fossil fuel subsidies, that hit a record of 7 trillion in 2022. And still, wind and solar just accounts for around 12% of global electricity generated. It's still fossil fuel, baby drill, baby. So, and that's what we are seeing, especially in the context of the invasion of Ukraine. Europe wanted to diversify its sources of gas away from the so-called dictator and imperialist Putin. And then they go to, dictatorships in the region, like the Algerian dictatorship, like the Egyptian dictatorship, the settler colony of Israel, and the authoritarian Qatar to get more gas. It's just that discourse on, democracy and human rights is just empty rhetoric. But what we end up through these kind of deals is more gas lock-in, more extractivism, and more path dependency, and a potential for substantial stranded assets when the world, and especially Europe, moves towards renewable energy. So if the if some of the examples that I described so far can be described as decarbonization by dispossession, green grabbing, green neocolonialism, what takes place in occupied land in the region, either in Western Sahara or Palestine and the Golan Heights, can be called outright green colonialism, because it is happening without the approval of the indigenous and native populations, at their expense and by plundering their resources. And those projects create more dependencies with international capital and entrenches occupations. We are seeing that in Morocco, by Morocco, and we are seeing that in Palestine and the Golan Heights. In the book, there is a brilliant chapter by Manal Shqair on green and colonialism, settler colonialism in Palestine and the Golan Heights. And she showed how Israel has portrayed pre-94 Palestine as an empty, parched desert, which has become a blooming oasis after the establishment of the State of Israel. Obviously, that narrative is false, is deceptive, because it has been used to greenwash settler colonialism, and it helped Israel to cover up its theft, plunders, and war crimes against the Palestinian people. And she describes one dynamic of the eco-normalization, which is the normalization of relations between Israel and the surrounding Arab countries, but also beyond, not just in the Arab country, in the field of renewable energy, water desalination, and agriculture. It's not just about greenwashing colonialism, but it's also about creating dependencies, about integrating Israel as a dominant force in the regional economy. So then water security, energy security, and food security of certain countries like Jordan, like Morocco, like Egypt becomes more important than the Palestinian cause. And she describes some companies like the NLT, Newell, developing renewable projects all over the region, from Morocco to Sudan to Jordan and so forth, but also documents this project called Prosperity. Prosperity, which is between Jordan and Israel. It's on hold now because of the genocide, but I think it's gonna resume very soon. It has two components, blue and green, and this is an exact case study of green colonialism. So Prosperity Blue, which means Israel will construct a water desalination plant on the Mediterranean and will send the desalinated water to Jordan. Jordan described as a parched desert, without looking into the dynamics of water plunder that Israel has been exercising for decades. Israel has been stealing water from all the countries in the region. But then the other component is Prosperity Green. So an Emirati company called Masdar will construct a big solar plant on Jordanian land and will send all the green electricity to Israel, right? So this is not just a matter of dealing with a settler colony state in the region, but also about what it says and what hypocrisies and what dependencies it creates. Because Jordan gets gas from Israel. There is another deal, which is a $10 billion deal that Jordanian populations have been protesting because they call this is a betrayal, getting gas from the Leviathan field, and that will supply Jordan with 60 billion cubic meters of gas for over 15 years. So why do you build the solar plant and send that green electricity to them, and at the same time get gas from them? You see the dependencies? So that's why the Jordanian government, it's really hard for them to budge and have a stronger position in terms of, it's just rhetoric really, because they are really economically dependent. And that's what normalization does to you. I will finish with three slides, just to center Palestine in this equation, in this discussion on green colonialism in the region. Because I believe that there are important intersections between the Palestinian struggle for liberation and the climate struggle. And it's not just pure rhetoric, because there will be no climate justice without the liberation of Palestine, for various reasons. The Colombian president in COP28 in Emirates said it clearly. Genocide and barbaric acts unleashed against the Palestinian people is what awaits those who are fleeing the south because of the climate crisis. What we see in Gaza is the rehearsal of the future. He is absolutely right. Because if we do not organize vigorously against that system, that's what's going to happen. We are already seeing it. Millions of brown and black and white working class people are being sacrificed in order to maintain the profits, in order to maintain a certain lifestyle. And we've seen it clearly in Baku in the last climate talks. The global north countries are willing to finance a genocide, to finance wars that kill people, but are not willing to put the money to tackle the climate crisis. And what happens in Palestine is really hard to describe it in words. Like, we fail to find the right words and terminology to describe it because of the utter destruction. It's not just a genocide, it's also an ecocide. It's environmental warfare. It's also a holocide, what people refer to as the annihilation of the whole ecological and social fabric of life itself. But there are also intersections between the climate crisis, the genocide, and the war and the military-industrial complex that are understudied. Just in the first 2 months of the genocide, Israel emitted, just in 2 months, more than the annual emissions of 20 countries in the world, the most vulnerable countries in the world, just in 2 months, right? And half of those CO2 emissions comes from the shipping of weaponry by the United States, which points also to the active involvement of the United States in this genocide and ecocide. But much more importantly, I would argue that the Palestine liberation struggle cannot be dissociated from the struggle against global fossil capitalism and US-led imperialism for two main reasons. The two key pillars of US hegemony in the region are Israel as a Euro-American settler colony, which is an advanced outpost for the United States to maintain its domination of the region and control of the vast oil resources. The second pillar is the oil-rich reactionary Gulf monarchies that have huge reserves of fossil fuels. The rapprochement of these two key pillars through the normalization deals that we've seen through the Abraham Accords, and there was anticipation that we're gonna see a normalization with Saudi Arabia. Maybe it's gonna happen. The idea to approach those is to integrate Israel politically and economy, as I said, as a dominant force in the region, and to bury the Palestinian cause. So Palestine liberation is not just a human rights or moral issue, but it's fundamentally and essentially a struggle against fossil capitalism and US-led imperialism in the region and beyond. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Hamza, for that fantastic overview of a number of key issues, and it was depressing and inspiring in equal measure, or at least that's how I found it. So thank you so much for that. That's fantastic. So the floor is now open for questions in the room and online. Gary, I think you'll read out any questions that come in online, but I can start with any questions we might have in the room. Please raise your hands, and we have a roving microphone. Who would like to go first? Question down the front here.
Hi, I'm Philip Proudfoot. I'm a research fellow at Institute of Development Studies. This is like not a fully formed idea, but or a fully formed question, and you've touched on it in the talk, but I'm curious about the relationship between authoritarian regimes in the MENA region as a comprador class, as propped up and supported by Western imperialist powers, and their ability then to continue resource extraction as a core means through which they maintain their rule, and the barriers that that places on alternatives like activists rising up and fighting against this. So the failure of the Arab Spring, or the collapse of the Arab Spring, and then the restoration of authoritarian powers, who are then able to, of course, they don't want to see a kind of just transition. They want an unjust transition in order. So if there's going to be a transition, they want it to replicate presumably the same patterns of extraction that came with fuel. So how do we think about that relationship between like compradorism and authoritarianism in the region and Western imperialist powers? Thank you.
Do you want to answer that one? I don't think we've got other, was another, do you want to take
Let's
one
get
more
more.
question?
Yeah,
Take
let's
one
go.
more, yeah.
Hi, I'm Boris. I'm from the Centre for International Education. Yeah, thanks. It was I really found it really interesting. I was working as a teacher in Baghdad at a private school, and I was teaching sustainable development goals, including a load of stuff about climate change, to the children of basically the really wealthy, the children of oil dealers and militia people and all kinds. And I guess I'm thinking about how, it's part of an education system that we teach that the really privileged and the elites of that area are likely to learn about this. And there's loads of contradictions involved in that, like in terms of class, because I think in terms of Orientalism, it creates this big gap in the elites learn that Iraq is a polluter country, and that this is a problem that maybe they can solve by being more like Western ways of thinking, but also their parents are deeply implicated in the fossil fuel industry. So I'm kind of rambling a bit because these are just thoughts coming out. But it feels like it ties to these things that we're talking about here, and I just wanted if you had any thoughts on it. Thank you.
Yeah. 2 questions.
So I'll start with the question of imperialism and democracy. Let's start with the Arab uprisings. So we saw a wave of inspiring revolutions, and let's call them revolutionary uprisings in 2010, 2011, Tunisia, Egypt, and so forth. So we've seen an inspiring outburst of popular power. People wanting to take things into their hands, to democratize their societies. But it was not just about, freedom and democracy in the liberal sense, like we want elections, but much more, it was about material struggles. Because when you look at the slogans that they were using, they were talking about bread, about social justice, about dignity. And these are not just about freedom and elections as how the Western media wanted to portray them. These people just wanted, freedom in the Western way, but people wanted sovereignty, wanted bread, wanted jobs, wanted to transform their own economies. But what we've seen in many cases, we've seen the rise of counter-revolution at the local level, but also at the international level. Because those revolutions, especially in Egypt, were really threatening the interests of US imperialism and also the Israeli presence there. So that has to be controlled to some extent, and that's what happened. So we've seen interventions by a lot of Western powers, especially international financial institutions, trying to dictate what economic model and what transition, they called it actually the transition at the time, what economic transition that you wanted to do. And a lot of us were arguing that it was a neoliberal and neo-colonial transition. They wanted to maintain exactly the status quo. They wanted to privatize even further, open up those economies more to foreign capital. That's what happened in Tunisia. That's what happened in Jordan. That's what happened in Egypt. Of course, there are local forces that played that role in terms of alliance with international capital, and you called them right. Some of them are comprador forces They serve the interests of, you know, big capital, the interests of empire, and of course they benefit from it. They you know, pile their pockets with rents from various reasons. So when we talk about just transition, and I didn't get the time to go into what I mean by just transition and what are its principles, the questions of democracy is central, because how can you talk about moving towards renewable energies, or let's say sustainability or sustainable economic model that serves the interests of the people, that talks about sovereignty and justice, when you live under a military dictatorship like Egypt? You simply can't. So, but at the same time, we cannot reduce democracy to elections or to the liberal type of democracy that we have in the West, because I don't believe that's democracy. Political democracy without socio-economic justice, without people's sovereignty on their economic systems, is not democracy. So we are talking mainly about democratizations in how Samir Amin, the Marxist Egyptian, has been describing. It's an ongoing process. It's democratizing economic system. It's about redistribution of wealth and so forth. But just transition is also an anti-imperialist project. It cannot just happen in one country, like in Tunisia or Egypt. It needs, you know, a kind of building an autonomous regional project, democratic, just, that can create or shift some balances of forces. Because how can, you know, the United States or Tunisia and Morocco can stand up to the United States? It's about that we are moving into multipolar system. It has its threats, but it has its opportunities as well. And I think we need to take into account the resources that are in the region, the importance of the region to global capital, and keep, you know, fighting for democratization. And that democratization needs to be anti-imperialist at the same time. The second question in Baghdad, and you were talking about sustainability, education, and, you know, so when we talk about just transition, I don't think it is an elitist project. Just transition came from the convergence of three important struggles. That was in the 70s in the United States: the environmental struggle, the workers' struggle, and also the indigenous community struggle. They were fighting the chemical industry at the same time that was trying to divide them and to say, you know, it's about jobs. And so these three movements came together despite their conflicting interests and said, we are fighting one same system that exploits workers, that destroys the environment, and that dispossesses indigenous communities of their land. That's where that just transition framework and concept came from. It came through struggle from communities. And of course, that framework and concept gets co-opted by, you see companies now using just transition, and, you know, even leaders using just transition. But it is a terrain of struggle. We need to recapture those concepts that have been rooted in struggle from the start and give them the meaning that we need. Just transition for me is a revolutionary project. Of course, we need to transition from some system of, you know, extraction, plunder, and death to a better system. So we need a kind of a transition. But it is a revolutionary, it has a revolutionary vision, and it is an anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist framework. At least that's how I see it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, do you want to read a couple of questions online?
Okay, this is anonymous. Given the male-dominated nature of the energy governance structures in Arab countries and focusing on just transitions, how is the MENA region ensuring that current and future conversations about energy governance and just transition include women and other marginalized communities that are included in the decision-making and solution-creating processes?
Yeah, John in the room, yeah.
One more online, shall you?
I'm just going to say one in the room and then we'll come back to you. All right, let's take three.
Yeah, thanks, Hamza. That was very wide-ranging, so trying to unpack things in my mind. My name is John. I work with the Bretton Woods Project. We are a World Bank and IMF watchdog, and I'm also a Sussex alumni. Yeah, you mentioned a little bit the role that donors and the IFIs are playing in not only funding some of these green projects, but also providing the sort of policy blueprint. So I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit in terms of the sort of policy side of things, and indeed how you see those sort of dynamics playing out in different countries in the region, and what are the sort of levers for democratizing that sort of like policy side of what you term green colonialism. Thank you.
Take one more online. You got one more there.
This is from Mardi, who's a PhD student and researcher here at IDS. My question is regarding how your work deals with the idea of fossil capitalism. Do new green colonial projects threaten it at all, particularly the future of these projects? How does the debt dimension impact the radical feasibility and potential of green technology? And how does this change for countries who are not indebted, like Saudi, UAE?
Take those questions in any order that you'd like to.
Okay. So maybe I'll start with the question of the donors and the IFIs. So I'll try to give you like specific examples and get a copy of the book. There are many details. So let's say in Egypt, what the IFIs have been trying, the international financial institutions, is to liberalize the energy sector, but also to push for the removal of the subsidies on energy and to try to commodify energy. So it moves from a public service towards a commodity. So the chapter by Mohammed Gadi in Egypt has documented this in detail in terms of how the IFIs have been pushing this through a narrative that, you know, if you privatize, things become much more efficient and there is wastage. Basically, we're saying you are subsidizing the whole energy for the whole population. That needs to be targeted, and this opened the door slowly towards, you know, privatizing energy. And they are doing this as well in terms of renewable energy. The same story also happened in Sudan in terms of the generation of hydropower. Tunisia, Morocco, all of these international financial institutions played an active role in terms of you know, liberalization and privatization. And this is not just in the energy sector. It happens also in agriculture. It happens in other public services. So we cannot just, you know, separate the energy from the broader neoliberalization of the economy that is taking place by pushing also for foreign capital to be involved much more actively in those economies. In Tunisia, one of the slides that I showed, that was in 2023 when the Italian Prime Minister, the Dutch Prime Minister, and also the EU Commissioner, Ursula von der Leyen, visited the country at a time of, you know, an acute economic crisis. And one of the things that they said they're gonna do, they're gonna put some money to help the ailing Tunisian economy, but it comes with certain conditions. And the two main pillars in there were energy and agriculture. So they want Tunisia to continue exporting agricultural products with competitive prices to the EU market, but at the same time, they wanted more renewable energy coming from Tunisia to the European Union. And they are doing this in various ways. There are many projects on the table. There is green hydrogen. There is also the interconnection between Tunisia and Italy, the ELMED, called ELMED projects, and we're gonna publish a study very soon around this, because what they want is for green electricity to come from Tunisia, but also for the excess of electricity from Italy when there is that excess to go to Tunisia. So it's they are doing all these things at the same time. Even for countries like Algeria that have been resisting that intense neoliberalization, but they are moving towards that direction, we are seeing the influence of international development agencies like the GIZ. So the GIZ, I have mentioned it a lot because it's playing a very important role in there. So all the green hydrogen strategies of these countries, Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, have been either entirely written or shaped by the GIZ. And you can guess that they have not written it for the interest and the sake of the local populations, but within a certain paradigm of privatization, opening up for German capital and other capitals, and also to export rather than produce for the local population. The question of the male-dominated nature of the fossil fuel or energy infrastructure and energy governance. I don't think this is just in the Arab region, by the way. I think it is a male-dominated infrastructure and sector everywhere. And I think one of the big principles of the just transition that we are talking about is that we are saying just transition is a gender question. And I think, as you see here, the cover of the book, the idea of putting these resisting and fighting women, these are from Morocco, in a town called Imeder. They have still this biggest silver mine in the continent. These communities of Imeder have been engaging in a long and inspiring struggle against that silver mine. A lot of them have been, arrested, beaten up, but they ended up, since after the, Arab uprisings from 2011 to 2019, erecting a camp that blocked the water access to the silver mine, because that silver mine was plundering their water, affecting their agriculture, and not providing them with the promised development goals and jobs and infrastructure and that they were talking about. Why did we choose specifically this picture? First of all, to show the continuities between extractivism in the fossil fuel and mining and agribusiness sectors and the green extractivism, the new extractivism and the new green colonialism that we are seeing in renewable energies. But at the same time, to show that people are resisting, and the biggest victims of the climate crisis and ecological crisis and energy and food crisis tend to be the vulnerable sections of our society, including women. So we cannot have a just transition without, having it as a feminist revolution. So that question of how do we deal with that, I don't think we need to reform the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry needs to be made accountable for the damages that it has been doing. How do we do that? That's a different question. Fossil capital and green capitalism. I don't think that fossil capitalism is being displaced by green capital, not at all. The region is still rooted in, not rooted, I would say it's one of the main or the core regions of global fossil capitalism, especially the Gulf countries. There are two chapters actually on the Gulf in the book, one by Adam Hania and the other one by Christian Henderson, showing how, first of all, the Gulf countries are gonna be a big obstacle to any transition, either in the region or globally. I didn't show the slide where the Saudi minister, the energy minister in 2021 said, every hydrocarbon will come out. We will be the last man standing. But they're not just doing fossil fuel projects. They are using the money, the income that comes from the fossil fuels to diversify their economies and to invest in renewable energy projects in their own countries, in the region and beyond. And they are going also into carbon offsets. So I mentioned Saudi Aqua Power, I mentioned Masdar companies. These companies are really involved in renewable energy projects. Some people would say this is just greenwashing. It plays, the function of greenwashing, but it's not just greenwashing. The Gulf countries want to maintain their relevance in the global capitalist economy. When the move towards, renewable energy comes, they will be in a dominant position. They are doing also green hydrogen. So it's fossil and green capital that happen in parallel, intertwined. A lot of the companies that we are seeing in the world right now, the fossil fuel companies like Total, BP, Eni, are doing also renewable energy projects. So we need to be really aware what's happening in here. It is green capitalism. It is, fossil and green capitalism working together. But those companies want to continue to have a relevance. That's why they rebranding themselves as energy companies, like Total Energies now. It was Total, but it's become Total Energies. So it's about other renewable energies. BP even at some point was using the brand Beyond Petroleum. So they want to continue. And green hydrogen is one avenue for them to do that. A lot of fossil fuel companies are investing in hydrogen projects.
Okay, we'll throw open to more questions. But I'm also just going to briefly abuse my position as chair to ask you a question to really push you a little bit about any grounds for hope that you have, or what the roots of resistance might be to fossil capital, or you mentioned before the need to sort of reclaim the term just transition, to sort of deepen it, to democratize it, to pull it away from the sort of way in which it's been co-opted. Can you give us some entry points, some grounds of hope from what you've seen either in the region or more broadly around successful attempts to contest green colonialism? So hold on to that question, and we'll just see if there's others either online or in the room. Yeah, Will. Sorry, Will, and then you.
Will, Global Studies. Kind of linked to Pete's question, actually. I wanted to focus on the title of the book, really, the Dismantling Green Colonialism. And I think you've talked a bit about what dismantling green colonialism might look like as a kind of endpoint of sovereignty and democracy. But what does it look like as a process? How do we get there? What does the struggle for dismantling green colonialism look like?
Hello. Could you please tell us more about green hydrogen in Tunisia? So we know that the national strategy of green hydrogen was led mainly by GIZ, and more specifically about the water challenge to produce hydrogen, because we know that Tunisia is a water-stressed country, and they are talking about desalination as a solution that we will not touch ground resources of Tunisia. But also when I went through the summary of the national strategy of green hydrogen, I didn't see that there is a clear idea or a clear vision of how the waste of desalinated water will be canalized, because if we will put it again in the seawater, it will also make a lot of progress. So what are the solutions for that, if there is a?
Thank you. Take those three questions.
Yeah. So I think your question and Will's questions are similar, so I'm going to address them at the same time.
Okay.
I think I get asked these questions all the time, like what is the way forward? What is to be done? What is the solution? And I think it's not up to me as an individual to come up with all those solutions and to give a prescription or a blueprint or revolutionary blueprint to how to do the revolution, because things do not happen that way. Things happen through struggle, through organized movements that come up with solutions, but that starts with, I would say, a correct analysis and diagnosis of the problem. Because for now, most of the solutions that are being put forward is green capitalism and even green colonialism and green imperialism. that want to maintain the status quo. They tell us we're going to use technology, we're going to use market mechanisms, things are going to take some time, we're going to, resolve the issues in the future without the need of a radical social economic transformation. And I think in here, we need to reframe the issues. We need to reclaim the narrative that the climate crisis, the ecological crisis that we find ourselves in is just a manifestation of capitalist exploitation and imperialist domination of human and nature. When we have the diagnosis, our solutions, our vision needs to be an anti-capitalist vision. Of course, we're not gonna do that overnight. We need to keep organizing in every sphere and sector of the economy and society to undermine capital. But we need to ask the right questions first. If we do not ask the right questions, the solutions that we're gonna put forward are gonna be just false solutions. So the questions that we need to ask in terms of the energy transition, I mentioned some of them. Energy for what and energy for whom? If we're gonna continue the same intensive production patterns that we have here in the north and globalize it everywhere, imagine having the same levels of consumptions in China, in India, in Africa, everywhere, the planet won't be enough for us. We're gonna destroy it. So in that respect, one of the elements of the solutions is, I'm very sympathetic to the degrowth movement in the north. Degrowth in the richest pockets in the global north, and degrowth also in the richest pockets in the global south, but mainly in the global north, because the global north has been responsible for causing that climate crisis. So degrowth is one part of it, because we cannot continue consuming. Imagine everybody here in the UK, every family has 2 electrical cars. Where would those resources come from? The lithium, the cobalt. It means more extraction somewhere else, more sacrifice zone somewhere else, and more exploitation somewhere else. And that's how capitalism works. Capitalism is a system, as Bellamy Foster has said, is a system of unpaid costs. It always externalizes those costs somewhere else. It externalizes them to women and carers through reproduction work, unpaid reproduction work. It externalizes them from urban to rural areas where a lot of the mining and those big projects are taking place. It externalizes them from north to south through imperialism and equal exchange and the creation of sacrifice zones in the global south. But also it externalizes them to nature, because nature is considered as a commodity, as something to be dominated, and as waste, or you put the waste there. And the climate crisis is the result of this. When we have the analysis, we need to have anti-capitalist visions. But you would tell me, okay, what we should be doing now? There are a lot of things that can be done now. First of all, energy and other public services need to be seen as public commons. So we need to fight for deprivatization. Deprivatization can take various forms in various contexts. It could be nationalization, it could be local ownership, it could be public partnerships, it could be cooperatives, and there are a lot of struggles all over the world for this, including in our region of the world. I work specifically with trade unionists in Tunisia, specifically a group called the Working Group for Energy Democracy. That's what they are pushing forward. We are for energy as a public service, as a working public service. So we need to deprivatize. We need to push against the infiltration of private capital into that sphere. Democratization, we mentioned that. Democratization is, for me, much more to do with the involvement of local communities and workers in important decision-making. So when you have those big solar plants and wind farms, local communities need to be properly consulted, and they need to embrace that project. Of course, there will be tensions, but that projects need to be largely working for them, creating value in their local communities, creating jobs and real development. And when we talk about decolonization, to come to decolonization, there are various avenues. And in here, I think I prefer to give a concrete example. So decolonization for me means an anti-imperialist position. You need to challenge the subordinate position that your economy has been imposed by the global capitalist economy. And that means moving up the value chains. That means industrialization, green industrialization. Indonesia, for example, is, I think, the richest country in terms of nickel reserves. Nickel is being used in electrical batteries for electrical vehicles. So the Indonesian ruling classes said, okay, so there is an opportunity for us there. And of course, it comes with negative, maybe there will be a lot of extraction, but I think in general, I would support the idea. They said, okay, there is an opportunity for us. We're not gonna export nickel in its raw form because we're gonna just reproduce, dependency, and we remain in the bottom of the value chain as just exporters of cheap natural resources while externalizing, the environmental costs to us. So they said, we're gonna process those minerals inside and create more value and create more industrialization. And I think that's the right way forward, but that's not enough. So we need to make sure that extractions is not going to generate more extractivism for the local communities, and also that the markets for those electrical batteries and the manufacturing should first go to the local economy, Indonesia, the regional economy, and then the international markets, rather than exporting again those electrical batteries to the European Union. But when Indonesia did this, the European Union took Indonesia to the court in the World Trade Organization, saying basically, how dare you use your resources in a sovereign way? So there are constraints in the global capital. When you challenge your subordinate position in the global capitalist economy, the empire won't just watch. They will come down on you, will tell you no. But there are opportunities. Many countries, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, even Zambia, are saying we're not going to export our cheap natural resources. We need industrialization in our countries. We need to acquire the technology. That's how you do it in a sovereign way. It's not going to be perfect. There will be tensions here and there and contradictions, but I feel this is something that we should support.
Question about hydrogen.
Hydrogen, yeah. Hydrogen is a big, actually we published a study on green hydrogen. That was last year. EJNA, yeah. It is in English, Arabic, and French, where we looked at some of the green hydrogen projects and the strategy and what the Tunisian government is planning to do. First of all, as you said, it has been shaped and written strategy by GIZ, by the Germans, and I'll give you an anecdote. So there was Heinrich Böll, which is a foundation affiliated with the Green Party in Germany. They commissioned a study on green hydrogen in Tunisia. And the journalist who has done the study, she has been critical. She's raising questions and concerns about the risks and also about maybe the neo-colonial nature of some projects. That study has been leaked to GIZ somehow. And they went ballistic, crazy. They tried to censor it and they couldn't. They participated in a public debate around it, and the representative of the GIZ, this is also all documented, you could look at video, everything is recorded. The German representative from GIZ was so condescending to the Tunisians, saying basically, we come here like the civilizing mission, like colonial civilizing mission. We are putting money, we are telling you how to do it, how technology, and now you're accusing us of colonialism and so forth. The Tunisians went hard on her. They saying, look, all we care is that these projects are gonna work for our local economy. If they are not gonna work for our local economy, we're gonna say no. But you're raising many important questions in terms of the desalinate, like the salts that go back to the water. And many studies have looked at the environmental impacts, and they may affect the biodiversity in those regions. And I don't think they are taken into account at all, and they are not saying exactly what are they going to do. But it's not just, for me, it's not just about that. This is important. Of course, it is important. It's about why do you do those projects in the first place? Because green hydrogen, to get into green hydrogen, you need to generate green electricity first, right? So you need to build big solar plants and wind farms on huge surfaces of land. Why don't you use just the green electricity for your local economy? Why do you use that green electricity to break the water molecule, generate the green hydrogen, and then the green hydrogen you export it? First of all, that whole process is inefficient. You're gonna lose a lot of energy throughout that process. But then you end up with a primary commodity, which is hydrogen, for export. So creating new forms of dependency. It's not, and the technology is not gonna be transferred. Those German companies, they're not going to transfer the technology. They're going to come, build those projects, make them into export projects, and that's it. So what is the value? When I talk about green hydrogen, I'm not against green hydrogen per se. Green hydrogen is going to play a role in the decarbonization of the economy in certain sectors where you cannot use green electricity, like the steel industry. You may use green hydrogen there. Green hydrogen may be used in long distance transport, maritime transport and air transport, where the current technologies of electrical batteries are not efficient, but it's not that miraculous solutions that they are used. I believe in green electricity. Use that green electricity, achieve your energy self-sufficiency, use it in your own industries to green your own industries. And this is a completely whole new paradigm that breaks with the neoliberal and neo-colonial economy that is enforced on our countries. It is about, delinking from the imperialist capitalist system. Delinking is a concept that has been pushed by Samir Amin. I'm deeply influenced by Samir Amin. Delinking is not an autarky, like you become self-sufficient and you do everything. No, it's about challenging the position you are put into the global capitalist economy, move up the value chain, build an inward-looking economy, a market, and that cannot happen in one country. In North Africa, there is a huge potential to build a regional economy. With European Union, they are integrating themselves. How are we gonna face them if we just talk to them one country by? No, you need, and this is a deeply democratic, anti-imperialist project. And that starts with democratizing the societies, but also having that anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist. And that cannot happen overnight, by the way. We've seen waves of uprisings and revolutions in the region. They need to continue.
Thank you. So we've ended on a positive note. So we're out of time, but before we close, I just want to remind everyone that the recording will be available on the IDS website and will be emailed to all attendees. So do please share it and do sign up for next week's lecture. But thank you, all of you who've come this evening, all of you who've joined online. There are some copies of the book available. Do you want to say how people can pay for them?
Yeah, so copies of the book are available just by donations, whatever you can afford. And the donations will go to the Ghassan Abu Sitta Children's Fund. So you can donate directly there, or you can give me money and I can donate. Thank you.
So please join us in the bar if you have further questions. I think there's time for a drink and further discussion downstairs. But please join me first of all in thanking Hamza for a fantastic talk.
That's fantastic. Thank you.